Summer, 1900. In a sweltering New York tenement, a mother watches milk spoil in the summer heat because the ice she depends on to keep it safe just tripled in price overnight, with no warning and no explanation posted anywhere she could see or read, and no other way for her family to afford the difference. Ice wagons that used to rattle down her block every single day now skip it entirely for 2, sometimes 3 days at a stretch, leaving families to guess when the next delivery might actually come. Families across the tenement are rationing what little ice they can still afford, stretching a single small block across a full week in the very worst heat of the summer, watching it shrink to nothing long before the week is over. And the men who tripled that price, quietly, all at once, across the entire city, happen to own the mayor. We're not going to name them yet, because to understand how a block of frozen water became powerful enough to buy a city government, we have to go back almost 100 years earlier, to a failed Boston businessman everyone thought was insane. In 1806, a 23-year-old Bostonian loaded a ship with frozen pond water and sailed it toward the Caribbean. Everyone in the harbor watching him do it was certain they were watching him throw his family's fortune straight into the sea. His name was Frederic Tudor, and the idea itself sounds almost too simple to be revolutionary. Cut ice from frozen New England ponds in the dead of winter, load it onto a ship, and sail it to the tropics, where nobody had ever had reliable access to ice in their entire lives, some of them having never even seen or touched it before. Boston newspapers at the time openly mocked the plan as the scheme of an eccentric young man with far more money than sense, a headline-ready punchline about a rich man's foolish obsession. When Tudor's first shipment reached Martinique, most of the ice on board had already melted away entirely during the long, hot voyage, and there was no local infrastructure whatsoever waiting to receive what little survived. No insulated storage, no established market, no real understanding among prospective buyers of what to actually do with this strange, cold, half-melted cargo sitting on the dock. The venture lost money almost immediately, and it wouldn't be the last time it did over the years that followed. Tudor spent years afterward teetering on the edge of complete financial ruin, plowing what little money he could scrape together back into the idea again and again, despite every reasonable signal telling him to stop, and by some accounts was briefly imprisoned for unpaid debts tied directly to his ongoing obsession with proving the concept could eventually work at scale. Most people in his position would have quietly walked away and let the idea die. Tudor didn't. Sit with that for a second. An entire global industry, one that would eventually ship New England pond ice all the way to India on the other side of the planet, started with a man everyone in his own hometown considered a joke, repeatedly, publicly failing for the better part of 2 decades before anyone took him seriously. It took Tudor nearly 20 years of failure before 2 separate breakthroughs, one about how ice was cut and one about how it was stored, finally turned his obsession into a genuine empire. By the 1850s, ice cut from frozen New England ponds in January was arriving, still solid, on the doorstep of Calcutta, India, roughly 4 months and 13,000 miles later. The first breakthrough came from an associate of Tudor's named Nathaniel Wyeth, who in 1825 invented a horse-drawn ice plow capable of cutting large, remarkably uniform blocks of ice directly out of a frozen pond, far faster and far more efficiently than the crude, slow hand-sawing methods that had come before it, methods that had barely changed in centuries. This single invention dramatically cut labor costs and let ice harvesting scale up into something resembling a true industrial operation rather than a slow, improvised, weather-dependent craft carried out by a handful of men with hand saws and a great deal of patience. The second breakthrough was almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight. Packing the cut ice blocks tightly in sawdust, a cheap, endlessly abundant waste byproduct, pouring out of New England's booming sawmill industry, which turned out to insulate the ice remarkably well and dramatically slowed melting during long ocean voyages through brutal tropical heat that would otherwise have destroyed the entire cargo within days. Between these two innovations, Tudor's ice trade expanded well beyond its shaky, near-bankrupt Caribbean beginnings, eventually reaching as far as Calcutta on the other side of the world, and it finally became genuinely, reliably profitable in a way it never had been during those first painful, humiliating decades of the venture. Tudor grew wealthy enough from the trade to earn a nickname that stuck with him for the rest of his life, spoken with equal parts respect and disbelief by the very same Boston circles that had once laughed openly at the original idea, the Ice King. Tudor didn't just get rich off an idea everyone had once mocked him mercilessly for. He created an entirely new industry from scratch, one that would go on to employ tens of thousands of seasonal workers across New England every single winter, cutting ice on frozen lakes in brutal, dangerous conditions that most people alive today have never even heard existed as an actual paying job. By the late 1800s, ice harvesting had become one of New England's largest seasonal industries, and also one of its most dangerous. Massive commercial ice harvesting operations sprang up on lakes like Rockland Lake in New York and Lake Wenham in Massachusetts, employing thousands of seasonal workers who cut, hauled, and stacked enormous ice blocks in genuinely brutal freezing conditions for weeks at a stretch every single winter, often working from before sunrise until well after dark to get the harvest in before a thaw. The work carried real, well-documented risks that were simply accepted as part of the job. Men drowned after falling through ice that gave way unexpectedly beneath them, sometimes while trying to rescue a horse or a fellow worker who had already gone under. Workers suffered severe crushing injuries when heavy blocks shifted, slid, or toppled during hauling on slick, uneven ice. And frostbite was a routine, almost expected hazard of the job, rather than a rare accident worth remarking on. Once harvested, the ice had to be stored somewhere capable of keeping it solid through an entire hot summer before it ever reached its final buyers in cities up and down the coast, which meant building enormous, heavily insulated ice houses along the shores of these same lakes, some large enough to hold tens of thousands of tons of ice at a single time, packed tightly in layer after layer of sawdust and hay to slow the slow, inevitable melt that would otherwise have claimed the entire harvest long before winter came back around to replenish it. This entire booming industry ran on one simple, unchangeable fact that no amount of capital could ever fully overcome. Ice only existed naturally where winter made it, tying the entire supply of a now essential product to geography and climate in a way most other commodities of the era simply weren't. And that scarcity, once it became unmistakably clear just how much money it could generate for whoever controlled it, was about to be turned into a weapon aimed squarely at the people who could least afford to pay for it. The household icebox quickly became a fixture of ordinary American domestic life, transforming how families stored food and completely changing what was considered safe to keep in a kitchen through the long summer months, especially perishables like milk, meat, and butter that had previously spoiled within a day or two in hot weather without any real way to prevent it. Iced drinks, mint juleps, and ice cream all became widely fashionable for the very first time thanks to a newly reliable ice supply reaching cities and towns far from any frozen New England pond, turning what had once been an impossible luxury into something a middle-class household could reasonably expect. Within a single generation, ice went from a rare, almost unimaginable luxury that most people would never personally encounter to something people simply assumed would always be available on demand, an assumption that would soon prove far more fragile and far more exploitable than anyone at the time realized. Before you assume a block of frozen water could never be turned into a real political weapon, look closely at what happened in New York City in the summer of 1900. This is where the cold open finally pays off. A financier named Charles W. Morse quietly consolidated New York's competing ice companies into a single, unified monopoly, formerly named the American Ice Company, but almost universally nicknamed the Ice Trust, once its true scale and ambition became public knowledge. Shortly after gaining effective control of the city's entire ice market, the company abruptly doubled, or, by some accounts, tripled, retail ice prices right in the middle of the brutal, punishing summer of 1900, with no meaningful competitor left standing to undercut the new price. Ice at the time wasn't some minor luxury reserved for New York's tenement poor to occasionally enjoy. It was essential, genuinely life-or-death infrastructure for keeping milk and food safe in unrefrigerated apartments during dangerous summer heat, a matter that was especially critical for infants, whose survival often depended directly on milk that hadn't already turned in the heat before it reached them. Investigations into the company's sudden, coordinated price hikes revealed that New York's own mayor, Robert Van Wyck, along with several other city officials, personally held stock in the very company now squeezing the city's poorest residents for a substance they had no real alternative source for, triggering serious public accusations of corruption tied directly to the timing and scale of the price increases. Public health officials and newspapers at the time directly connected the sudden price spike to a documented rise in spoiled milk and related infant illness and death during that summer's punishing heat wave, though it's worth being precise here that exact mortality figures attributable specifically to the price hike itself, as opposed to the heat wave more broadly, remain genuinely debated among historians studying the period. And the men running this monopoly weren't hiding in the shadows, conducting business quietly out of public view, avoiding scrutiny the way we might expect. Charles Morse went on afterward to build and control monopolies in shipping and banking as well, reportedly using much the same aggressive, rapid consolidation playbook each time, buying up competitors until a single hand controlled an entire industry, before eventually being convicted of banking fraud in a completely separate legal matter years later, a downfall that had nothing directly to do with the ice scandal that first made his name. And this wasn't some hidden, marginal problem tucked away out of public view. It was playing out in plain sight, in newspapers, in city council chambers, and on every single tenement block across the city at once, visible to anyone willing to look. Almost nobody remembers the Ice Trust scandal today, overshadowed in popular memory by the era's more famous railroad and oil monopolies. But at the time, it became one of the clearest early examples of what happens when a single company gains total control over something ordinary people simply cannot survive without, especially during the exact season when that necessity matters most. The Ice Trust scandal became one of the clearest public arguments of its era for why monopolies over basic, everyday necessities needed to be broken up by law rather than left to regulate themselves. Public outrage over the scandal, amplified relentlessly by the New York press, which ran story after story naming names and tracing stock ownership back to City Hall, put real, sustained pressure on city investigators to dig into the company's political connections and the mayor's personal financial stake in its continued success. The scandal fed directly into the broader progressive era momentum that was already building towards stronger antitrust regulation and trust-busting more generally, a political movement that would go on to define a significant stretch of early 20th century American politics, eventually reshaping how the federal government approached monopolies across dozens of unrelated industries, from railroads to oil to, eventually, the very kind of consolidated utility trusts that ICE itself had so vividly demonstrated. The dangers of. Much of the outrage's genuine power came specifically from the fact that ICE was universally understood by rich and poor alike, as a basic survival necessity rather than some optional luxury good. The same way salt and other subjects we've covered carried outsized political weight precisely because everyone, regardless of class or education, immediately understood what was actually at stake for their own household. What if the very industry built entirely on ice's natural scarcity was made completely obsolete within a single generation by a machine? The rise of mechanical refrigeration in the early 20th century rendered the entire natural ice harvesting industry essentially extinct within just a few short decades, an astonishingly fast collapse for an industry that had once employed tens of thousands of people every single winter and moved a genuinely enormous volume of commerce. New England towns that had depended heavily on seasonal ice harvesting as a core part of their local economy, sometimes the largest single employer in town during the winter months, lost that entire economic base almost overnight, with little warning and even less time to adapt or retrain for something else. Today, natural ice harvesting survives only in small, deliberately nostalgic niches, such as ice hotels rebuilt fresh each winter for tourists and competitive ice sculpture events that treat the old 19th century harvesting techniques as a curiosity and a spectacle rather than genuine, load-bearing industry the way it once was. Meanwhile, the fully mechanized global ice and cold chain industry that eventually replaced Tudor's entire empire now operates at a scale he could never have imagined even in his wildest ambitions, quietly underpinning modern food safety, medicine transport, and global shipping logistics worldwide in ways almost nobody outside the industry itself ever stops to think about. Ice harvesting is often romanticized today as peaceful, postcard-worthy winter work, all rosy cheeks, thick wool coats, and horse-drawn sleighs gliding gracefully across a frozen lake under a clear winter sky. The actual historical record tells a considerably harsher story, one of genuine physical danger, brutal sustained cold, and grueling seasonal labor that workers endured, largely because the pay, while modest, was often meaningfully better than whatever alternative work happened to be available in a rural New England winter with the ground frozen and farm work impossible. New England ice reportedly became, for a period, one of the region's most significant seasonal export commodities, shipped out by the ton to destinations most of the workers cutting it would never personally visit. A claim worth presenting carefully, given how much historical estimates on this specific point tend to vary between different sources and time periods. And there's something genuinely strange worth sitting with here too. Frozen New England pond water, gathered from small lakes most of those workers never left their home state to see beyond, once traveled further and was more prized as a genuine luxury import than almost any spice or textile of its era, reaching all the way to colonial India on a 4-month voyage across 2 separate oceans, a journey most of the ice itself didn't fully survive intact. An ordinary block of frozen water that turned one mocked, nearly bankrupt Bostonian into a fortune, built an entire brutal seasonal industry employing tens of thousands of workers every winter, and became powerful enough for a single monopoly to manipulate a major city's politics and public health at the exact same time, all before mechanical refrigeration made the whole industry vanish within a single generation, almost as if it had never existed at that scale at all. Today it sits, completely unremarkable, dispensed for free from a machine in nearly every hotel hallway and refrigerator door on Earth, taken so entirely for granted that almost nobody pauses to consider it a commodity at all anymore, let alone one that once ruined and made fortunes in equal measure. Next time you reach for a glass of it, you might think about a 23-year-old Bostonian mocked relentlessly by his own hometown newspapers for believing frozen pond water could somehow be sold across an ocean, about a mayor who quietly owned stock in the exact company squeezing his own city's poorest families during a deadly heatwave, and about an entire seasonal industry, once employing tens of thousands of people every single winter across dozens of New England towns, that a single new machine rendered almost completely obsolete within one generation, leaving barely a trace behind. That's really and truly the thing about food history. The most ordinary object in your freezer is usually hiding the strangest, most consequential story in the room, and ice, colorless, forgettable, ordinary in every possible way, and sitting quietly in nearly every kitchen on the planet, might be quietly carrying one of the most surprising fortunes and one of the most quietly forgotten scandals of all.